afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our presentation. I'm Hongbing. I'm a landscape architect. Also, I say regional planner. I'm actually not quite sure if I'm qualified to saying that, but I'm a registered landscape architect. And I graduated from this department over 20 years ago with MLA and LA&RP degrees. I have a architecture undergraduate degrees from Tsinghua University, and I also have a graduate diploma from McGill University. I have over 20 years of working experience in landscape architecture, urban planning, architecture. I was working as a volunteer at Boxborough Town planning board for over 4 years. I'm not going to take too much time because each of us have only 10 minutes. So I'm just going to go straight to my presentation today. Okay. So since the second half of last century, China has created a new Great Wall along its coastline with seawalls. And the total length of the seawalls is greater than that of the ancient China's Great Wall. So many of you have heard that, the adverse impact of the seawalls in China, but you may not heard of the new trends because there's not enough study. This is a research gap and also a research opportunity. So this preliminary study was done when I took Professor Elizabeth Infield's Planning for Climate class. And this reflects my research interest and also very preliminary emerging research work in sponge city and coastal resilience to combat climate change. So the goals of my studies are to understand the evolution of China's seawalls, to examine new trends, and to capture lessons learned. So my research questions are centered around my study goals. What is the evolution of what's the phenomenon of China's seawalls? What are the driving force behind this? And what are the lessons can we learn from this study? My research methods are both qualitative and quantitative, including literature review, trend analysis, and case study. So through literature review, I did I studied history of seawalls in China, which can trace back over 2,000 years. And this slide shows the ancient fish scale seawall developed in Ming Dynasty that still exists today. China's coastline has undergone tremendous changes since New China was founded in 1949, especially after China's open door policy was adopted in 1978. So driven by economic factors, over 3,000 kilometers of new shoreline has been created between 1980 to 2010. Meanwhile, the natural shorelines in China has decreased dramatically from 90% in 1978 to under 40% in 2010, just based on my literature review. So I did this trend analysis combining two separate studies done by two different groups of researchers with satellite data of the past 40 years. This chart shows the magnitude and evolution of coastal reclamation work in China from 1980 to 2020. So China's coastal development has huge environmental consequences. As a result, 50% of the nation's wetlands has been filled, and a quarter of the world's shorebird populations were threatened. According to my literature review, the annual loss of ecosystem services due to reclamation of China's coastal wetlands is estimated to be $31 billion US dollars, or roughly 6% of China's gross marine products. This chart was compiled by Greenpeace with a different source of information from the Sea Area Usage Management Bulletin published in China. Although there were some up and downs, and you can see the general trend is also declining in recent years. So you may wonder, what's the reason behind that? But the reason for this shift is China's new policy of coastal land conservation. Concerning the huge environmental impact and ecological services loss, in 2013, China began to establish this so-called marine ecological conservation redline system. This is as part of the national ecological conservation redlines program in China. In start 2017, the central government issued a series of guidelines and standards for ecological seawall construction and also conservation, like ecological conservation projects. 2018 is a big year. In this year, China suspended all coastal reclamation projects nationwide. So I think as landscape architects, but some of you are emerging landscape architects, planners, you may find this drawing is interesting. This is in the government document issued in 2019. This is a typical ecological seawall sections illustrated in color, just like a section done by our student landscape architects. That's in the government document. And it shows front, mid, and back zones of protection with green strategies. And this shows a sense of ecological sensitivity. It indicates a sense of ecological protection sensitivity. Sorry about that. So my case study. Now I'd like to talk about my case study. My case study is the East Dike project in Shenzhen. I heard about this project from a colleague in China. I also found this information online. It is a very new project located in the Dapeng Peninsula. In 2018, the super typhoon, it's called a Mancute, hit southern China, so leaving the whole area severely damaged. The year after, there's an international competition, and the Dutch team won the competition. The Dutch team, KCAP and Felix, won the competition. They did a master plan for 130-kilometer long coastline. They did a detailed design for 18-kilometer long coastal restoration, plus a 520-meter long coastal display area in Yangmeikeng, which is a model area that was first built and opened to the public in 2020. Interestingly, the team proposed a so-called triple dike strategy. It's an integrated approach to reorganizing the shoreline in response to climate change. And different from traditional seawalls, the team developed 3 protective zones. The inner zone has rain gardens, the mid zone has shifting seawalls, and the outer zone contains wave gardens. This may sound familiar to you. Remember the color section I just showed you? that fit the government recommendations and guidelines. So here are just some built photos. I'll quickly show you how each zone gets built and what it look like in each area. The inner zone is a collection of rain gardens and shared public open spaces. The middle zone has a series of shifting walls and plaza connect to a scenic walk. Very beautiful and graceful design. The outer zone contains wave garden with beach vegetation and rocks to combat the storm surge. This project gained a lot of international praise and also won several design awards since it's opened in 2020. I hope one day that I can visit the site. I want to interview people. Hopefully this can be done soon after the pandemic is over. Right now there's a travel restriction and also 3 weeks of quarantine time. So lessons learned. Here, China's seawalls have tremendous environmental consequences, as I think a lot of you have heard of it. It's causing huge ecosystem services loss, and the driving force behind, that's really the driving force behind the policy change. An integrated system with both hard and soft strategies, gray and green solutions could be the future direction. But the key is how to integrate them effectively. And seawalls does not have to be ugly. It can be beautiful. It can be integrated with park design and greenways. And lastly, China really needs established environmental protection legislation. The guidelines and standards they issued are just recommendations. They have no legal effect. So in conclusion, traditionally, coastal protection measures have relied on vertical defense structures like seawalls. And China's seawalls created this new Great Wall, destroying coastal wetlands and causing enormous loss of ecosystem services. A new trend starts to emerge in China's sea defense policy and practice. It is an important first step towards building a sustainable future with coastal resilience. Here are the sources for this brief talk. I have more references for the research work I continue to develop. Thank you so much.
I think I see a lot of familiar faces. My name is Alexandra Smialek, but I go by the Polish nickname Ola. I have a bachelor's in regional planning. I have a master's in regional planning from here, and I'm currently a fourth-year Ph.D. candidate. I have done multiple TA and RA positions, and most recently have been teaching the first-year seminar, which I know some of you from, as well as Dr. Infield's Climate Change and Resilient Cities class. And I am so excited to be here. And let me know if you can't hear me or anything. I am willing to just adapt a little bit. Oh, and I just got appointed to the City of Westfield Master Plan Committee. So I just wanted to share that with you. Thank you. Okay. All right, so summarizing the research I've done in 10 minutes, I will do my best, and I want to also just thank Dr. Henry Rensky for being my PhD advisor and dealing with everything that comes along with it. So my interests lie in the nexus between culture and economic development. So why culture and cultural economies for economic development? How do we bridge those two? Well, economic development strategies they should be diverse, right? We should design for the people and for residents. It should be, as much as aesthetics and design is important, it should incorporate as much as possible to the makeup of a city, its residents, its visitors, and the like. So I think as much as we should draw new visitors and residents into our cities, we also should work on prioritizing the residents that are already living there and seeing what their voices and what their stories are and how we can integrate them into economic development strategies. And then the need for revitalization is everywhere, especially in post-industrial cities. And creativity, innovation, uniqueness, that is in the heart of culture. It really, truly is. So the theoretical foundations of how I came to find my research journey is, I love the idea of economic development, I love the idea of culture, but how would I bridge the two? So I found most of my knowledge came from two theoretical paradigms. It came from Richard Florida's Creative Economies and Creative Class, and Anne Marcussin and Anna Godwa's Nicodemus Creative Placemaking white paper. So just to speak to this a little bit so you can have some context of what I mean by theoretical foundation, it's just that creative economies, they are important to how we approach cultural economies, and sometimes the terms are interchanged. They are made up of knowledge workers. They identify like the super creative core and creative professionals. It's really technology and knowledge-based. It comes under this umbrella of talent draws more talent. And you'll see in the image here, Richard Florida kind of breaks it up into what he calls the 3 T's. Technology, which speaks for itself, tolerance, which means allowing for diversity to be in the communities that are wanting to create these creative economies, and talent. So we often see talent as through universities and the like. But some limitations that I started to identify is with creative economies and this idea of revitalization through talent and technology. As we probably have all heard, gentrification and displacement is something that we have to consider. Classifications that Richard Florida has done can exclude individuals in the creative community because it has these like knowledge-based terms like highly educated or they have to have bachelor's degrees. So sometimes there has been some pushback. And then the need for creative clustering. So you have to have a mass of people to kind of build these economies and make them successful. And then for Anne Marcussin, I would argue that she's on the other end of the spectrum, but they kind of share similarities as well, which I won't be able to get into. But Anne Marcussin and Anne Godwa, they made a creative placemaking white paper, which was really arts and artist-based. And it prioritized the arts as a driver of regional wealth as well as revitalization. And the goal of it was to have artists in the communities come into the communities and share the stories and knowledge of people. Some identified limitations, of course, as well, are gentrification and displacement, which both authors do recognize. They also say that receiving funding is difficult and building buy-in, thinking that, okay, how can creativity really be representative of something like this in like a successful economy, and how can it be sustained? So then, where do I fit in? Well, as many of you know, and if you do not know, I love culture, traditional culture. I'm a first-generation Polish American, so I value language, knowledge from storytelling, food, come on, and cultural practices and businesses and products that are really unique to a cultural group. And we see sometimes this kind of cultural enclaves as like the representation of cultural economies, but we always see it as like a large scale. And I wanted to think, how can I apply it to something smaller scale to empower local, smaller communities? And that UNESCO framework, it just kind of sparked my interest because it spoke to more than just arts and knowledge, but also started talking about culture in the way that I saw culture, and I was inspired. So why does it matter in practice? As you all go into the field, as we continue research, these are just some of the many important considerations you have to make when you think about cultural economies and the research going forward. You want equity and inclusion. You have an opportunity for new economic base opportunities and a new approach to the way we see economic development. You can identify community brand and identity and what people, the makeup of the community. You can understand the value of culture, the true value, not a superficial commodification, but a celebration of the people that live in the city or town that you're in. And that's why I also say tapping into local assets with respect. That is important as a really critical part of this, because it's not just about, we have a lot of cultural resources, let's go into it and use what we have. So my 2 research questions that I'm going into forward through my dissertation prospectus is, how can cities integrate local cultural assets into their economic development strategies, along those that we saw in Richard, Florida and Marcussin's work? And how is that potential perceived for policymakers versus cultural community members? Because there might be a difference in perception and how they see that drive. And if they see it as relevant and critical, and if it's even needed or wanted, because that's an important conversation. My research area, this is all still changing, as I think research always does, is post-industrial cities in northeastern United States. So post-industrial cities are faced with economic decline, vacant buildings, and shifting identity. And it's that shift from manufacturing and production to service-based economies where cultural assets can find themselves in. So I want to research mid-sized cities, about 4 or 5 ideally. I've wanted to focus less on rural areas that may be limited to assets, and urban areas that may have access to more assets. I wanted to focus on the middle ground, the 100,000 to 300,000 people cities that might be something that we can look at more and have more research centered on. So I had to include a picture of this Polish store. It's in Chicago, so it's not in the Northeast, but it is probably as Polish as a Polish store can get. So my research methods going forward, it's about surveys and interviews. Those are primarily the 2 I want to focus on. So I want to survey cultural leaders, cultural businesses, both owners and employees, cultural community centers, and cultural clubs and organizations. Of course, this is all to be defined in the future. Surveys provide greater access to people. That does not mean they're easy. I have done surveys in much of my research, and it takes a lot of effort. But they offer a lot of variety of information, and you can ask a lot in the time that you have. But it's also not quick. I think a lot of people think it's a quick fix, but not exactly. But having a 10-minute survey may be easier to complete than a 1-hour interview. And then there's more individuals in these groups than the people I plan on interviewing. So I can outreach and see what I can get from them regarding information and at a larger scale, which is a lot of effort, I have to admit. And then for interviews, I want to look at the policymakers, as I mentioned in my research questions. Planners, of course, economic development officials, community development officials, and if resources and time allows, cultural leaders from those surveys that I had conducted. Interviews offer more detailed information. They allow you nuances that you might miss in a survey, where it's more objective, like agree or disagree, or a scale of attitudes. They take time, though, and they can build off of survey data, so you can break it up depending on, interviews first, surveys first, and vice versa. This is all to continue. But I also prioritize these individuals for interviews because there's often one or a few of each in the community. But with all that to say, research is a beautiful thing. It's not always easy with the pandemic wrench that we have been thrown. I think that we have to, understand that we're working through all of this and things change, and I wanted to highlight that. I wanted to show you that you have a plan and you can adapt it. You can look and see what the future will hold, and I want you to be excited about research regardless of if it's landscape architecture or regional planning. And I'm happy to discuss this more. So thank you so much, everyone.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sagar, and I'm a PhD candidate in the regional planning program. I come from India, if you already can tell. I have been working with the campus planning at UMass for the last 2.5 years as a planning assistant. Am I being loud? Okay. Perfect. Thanks, Theo. If during the course of talk, if I'm a little too loud, too low, just somebody sign at me and I'll try my best to adjust. So today we, 4 students, also wanted to introduce different broad areas of research in the PhD program and wanted to make sure that you guys can see what different exciting avenues of research are available for you to pursue as PhD and graduate students. Speaking about my talk, I think I want to take this opportunity to introduce you my dissertation interest and how it aligns with inclusive economic development. I'm going to be looking at the contextual role of neighborhoods as they align to economic mobility in low and medium income communities. So for the next 10 minutes, what I plan to do is give a little snippet of major concepts and how there are different caveats around it, around measurements, weave that conversation into the narratives of who are we talking about and why in specific of those groups, and then talk about the recent findings, which are incredibly important that navigate further research along these lines, and then make this conversation dive into how role of planning and landscape architecture plays an incredibly important role in all of these narratives. And finally, weave it to how I can make a difference through my small fractional part of dissertation. So the premise of my dissertation starts with the notion of American dream. And if you ask anybody what an American dream is, probably it is many things to many people. For some, it surely is that the idea of hard work and dedication will take you further ahead in life. But for many others who probably are struggling economically, it is the idea that even if you do a little better in your lifetime, there are better chances for your next generation to follow. And if you think about it, ubiquitously, the dictator script across the social classes is that you work hard, save a little, send your kids to college, expect them that they will be doing better, and probably retire in a warmer climate. Maybe warmer climate is debatable, but generally speaking, I think that is on point. And this dials back to the major concept of economic mobility, that is nothing but how one's economic success is defined by their own wealth, status, genetics, and majorly my focus, which is going to be neighborhood disadvantage or advantage that they live in or grow up in. So before we dive into the different caveats about economic mobility and how that translates into the neighborhoods and the importance of them, it is also important to understand that there are different ways where you can look at economic mobility. First major distinction is whether it is intra versus intergenerational. That simply boils down to a self-explanatory thing. Like when you see it in terms of intra, you're comparing within generations, and when you talk about inter, you're comparing across generations. And another important aspect to look at it is from the absolute or a relative sense. When you talk about absolute, you're really talking about whether there is a future threshold income that you capture towards broader economic growth. And when you talk about relative sense, it is talking about how an individual's position changes over the lifetime in parallel to their next generations. So this brings back to us that why do we even care in terms of planning? Why is economic mobility important for us? And just as much as climate change and global warming is one of the important issues, economic mobility is definitely important from the perspective of income inequality. And the reality is that when you look at the absolute mobility, it seems like a fine picture because 84% Americans are generally mobile and you feel that there is no considerable hardships. But when you dive into the relative mobility sense, then you see the intricacies of disparities. 70% of the people born at the bottom are remaining there and never reach the middle income. 43% remain at the bottom with the average mere earnings. And in the recent decades, what we have noticed is that economic mobility has definitely taken a hit, as a stagnant hit, as we compare United States with the other G7 countries. And most important findings from this is that there is also a equity component to it, meaning that it is considerably important and severe for some more than the others. And if you notice, in 2013, the United States federal government spent $384 billion in terms of asset development, which essentially dials back to one of the ways where you can improve economic mobility. And the dollars spent were going more towards the top quintile than the bottom ones, the needy ones, which is a matter of concern from planning perspective. So what we need right now is a holistic approach where the philanthropic organizations, the private and public sector collectively think towards this goal and understand how mobility from poverty could be achieved. And from the different caveats of research, there are multiple philanthropic organizations which are working towards this. To name a few, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or Center for Equitable Growth in Washington, or Brookings Institute, or Urban Institute. So all these have a consensus that mobility from poverty will not necessarily just be able to be achieved by mere gaining economic success. It also dials down to basically having power and autonomy and being valued by your community. So how do we achieve this? So there are three major pathways that we can achieve economic mobility. And once you start thinking from capitals, it boils down to human capital, financial capital, and social capital. Human capital basically is talking about how you invest in people and prioritize them first than places. You talk about educational attainment. You talk about how health and economy and interactions within them facilitates your economic mobility. And financial capital, it talks about how wealth transfer, home ownership are related to your economic mobility. When you have higher rates of home ownership, you have more chances of having more economic mobility. And lastly, social capital, which is going to be my focus of dissertation. It talks about family structure, school-based relationship, community influences, and work-related networks. So once you dial down in all three pathways, you notice that the most common thing in all of them is the background or the canvas, and that is the value and the role of places, neighborhoods where you grow up in. And this is a simulation synthesis of the findings from my literature review and work so far on this topic. And I think I want to begin with the economic studies, which are most seminal studies in this area. And in the series of studies, we understand that intergenerational mobility has a spatial variation to it. And the way these researchers came to that point is they clubbed the IRS data and matched and compared the siblings from same household and noticed that children who move to a neighborhood, better neighborhoods at the age of 6 have better chances of gaining economic success than children at a later age. So that tells you more that the place or context is playing a very important role in economic mobility. There are some of the important takeaways from these research papers, and that is that we know that there is a correlational factor between where you have more racially segregated neighborhoods, where you have higher income inequality, there you have a lower chance of mobility. And same applies for other facilities like quality of schools or family structures. When you have a single family household as compared to a non-single family household, that takes a toll on your economic mobility. To further this debate, I think from the field of sociology, we also have an important study which causally has how violent crime is related to economic mobility. So neighborhoods which are characterized with high rates of violent crime generally have low mobility. And then planning when we talk about urban planning, it seems like it has been, in many ways, unintentionally a part of problem. And sprawl, which has been empirically tested, has found that sprawl has a direct effect on economic mobility. When you have more and higher rates of sprawl and sprawling development, your economic mobility is low. And this points us to a very important hypothesis that is it just the matter of proximity and connecting people to jobs? Like if we solve the problem, does it solve the mobility issues? And if you think about it, it is more than that, because all the efforts to improve economic mobility in the domain of urban planning mostly have been centered through housing policy domain initiatives. Most importantly, I wanted to describe about the moving to opportunity experiment, wherein it was thought that if neighborhoods are the problem, why don't we just give money and dollars to people and facilitate their moves, which will probably solve the problem. And we tried that, and the research that evaluates those effective programs conclude that it doesn't really improve economic mobility. However, it does improve economic chances. So it solves half of the problem, but not the complete main goal and initiatives of those programs. So there is clearly work to do on our end. Oops, sorry, I think I missed one slide. All right, so what are the means that we can address these issues, these structural limitations? And because my decision is going to be focused on policy framework, I think I want to evaluate the structural limitations from the policy perspectives. So first and foremost is that we need to change the narrative, saying that people in poverty have no one else to blame but themselves. I think that is the first thing that needs to change. And we need to expose what are the structural limitations that they need to face and tackle in order to improve their economic chances. In order to do that, it has to be a collective effort, philanthropy, investment by public sector, meaning by investment by cities and towns, along with private sector needs to come to a common consensus and goals. Next important thing is we need to make sure that we have better access to jobs. And the way to do that is by improving the pathways to economic mobility. Next, on the same trail is how we break away from the fact that your zip codes do not define your destiny. And in order to do that, the first important thing is working on the underlying structural mechanisms which are at play in these disparities in the neighborhoods. And finally, we also need to work on bringing autonomy and power to the people and investing in solutions that reinforces work and allows them to use all the channels at their disposal. So how does all of this translate and trickles down to my research? I think I'm going to be focusing on majorly the third pathway, which is social capital, and I'm going to be building upon the interactive mechanism within it, and I'm going to be focusing on specifically bridging and bonding capital, which essentially ties down to how places allow natural interaction between people that facilitates these ties. And if they do not have that natural interaction, then how can you design and curate such places through design? And because also my focus is going to be policy oriented, I'm trying to look at the Community Reinvestment Act, which was enacted in 1977. And it encourages financial institutions to meet the needs of community by different lenders and banks and institutions. And there's a whole hierarchical structure to it, how they facilitate this. And I don't think for the purposes of this talk, we need to go in that. But essentially, my research question is going to be asking, are CRA investment projects helping to promote economic mobility? And specifically, are these investments aligned with the focus to generate these ties within the community? In order to do that, I plan to use social capital benchmark survey, which was developed by Harvard University's Kennedy School. And that survey allows me to develop design instrumentation that closely answers these queries. And I'm going to be planning to use the DID regression model to evaluate the post and pre-treatment periods. And I'd be happy to speak if any of you have worked along the lines of social capital, or anybody has experience working along CRA. I think it'd be interesting to know further details on that. And yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Henry, for putting up with the constant both of us.
All right, hello. I'm going to give a quick talk about my dissertation that was just defended yesterday, i.e. that's why it says PhD done. And I passed, most importantly, I passed, so that's great. My name's Alicia. I got a bachelor's degree in human behavioral sciences from Wilmington University and a master's of environmental studies from UPenn, and have been at UMass for the past 5.5 years getting my PhD. So my research focuses on urban greening, and if you've taken any of Theo Eisenman's or Robert Bryan's classes, you'll see that it becomes really easy to sound like everyone that you've learned from, because urban greening is the introduction and conservation or maintenance of outdoor vegetation in cities. How does that happen? Through many different types of policies, incentives, or organized programs. And for the focus of my dissertation, I looked at tree planting initiatives specifically, which Theo, has really made a mark in the industry by saying that these are quite different than municipal forestry or how municipal urban forestry has happened in the past. They're very intentional. They're situated for this need that cities are, not always as green as they could be or should be. So there is this concerted effort to make them greener. But how do you study all of these really nebulous and abstract things that relate people, place, vegetation, ecological systems, social systems, the interplay of them all? According to some folks that have been mainstreaming the social sciences in conservation style research, there's different levels of units and scales and any range of topics that you can be looking at this research through. And I found this article specifically really useful to know that you can do a lot of really great work, ask a lot of really interesting questions, and still have a lot more work to do in the future. Okay, so the focus of my dissertation, as I said, is on tree planting initiatives, but specifically on residential properties on or near streets. Why residential properties? Well, according to a lot of literature, this is where most of the plantable space exists in the United States, especially in the Northeast. Publicly owned lands are as covered as they can be with trees and vegetation. So the private sector, or really private residence, is really where we need to be looking. There's also a range of justice, environmental justice implications of giving people access to greenery in contexts where they had not been exposed to them. So this is the title of my dissertation, Residents' Perspectives of Young Street-Facing Trees, 3 cases from legacy cities with active tree planting initiatives. And I focused on the state of Massachusetts because there's just a lot of tree planting initiatives happening here. At the state level, at the federal level, at the local level, there's just so much going on. And the 3 cases that I spoke of, that I went into in a lot of detail in my dissertation, were looking at the role of residents' yard and tree preferences to their participation in a tree planting program, how someone's satisfaction with where they live could also influence their ability or really, capacity to participate in a tree planting program, and the role of street tree size and maturity to pedestrians' perceptions of safety. And we are running low on time, so I think I'm just going to skip through to the actual tree planting initiatives themselves because they're super interesting. So I focused on North Adams, Pittsfield, and Leominster for my first study. There's a combination of 2 different programs happening in these very small cities. One based from the U.S. Forest Service in order to create a gateway or link between these really heavily forested areas in the western part of the state. And then also in Leominster and Pittsfield, in addition to having those needs, there's a state-operated Greening the Gateway Cities program that is looking to increase the total number of trees on residential property for energy efficiency and cooling needs. Okay, my next study was looking in the town of Greenfield, where they too were also awarded a U.S. Forest Service landscape scale restoration grant to plant 1,200 trees. I don't know if you have ever planted a tree. It takes a lot of work to plant one tree and take care of one tree, but this city is armed and ready to plant 1,200 of them. And they have and will before 2022 is over. They've continued to work through the pandemic like rock stars. It's amazing. So my second study focused in Greenfield. And then lastly, my pedestrian safety study focused on the cities of Holyoke, Chicopee, and Springfield, because there's a lot of really interesting state funding out there for complete streets to make streets safer for pedestrians, bikers, people that use wheeled mobility for themselves or for their children. So much, safety concerns are really present in our communities nowadays, and street trees can play a part of that. So we focused on these three places for a lot of reasons. Come to find out, it's very hard to find a treeless street in many places in Massachusetts because we have a generally green area, but we did attempt to find some. And all in all, the key findings from this dissertation, can be distilled to say that, generally trees are always be preferred to no trees, especially for aesthetic reasons, which may be in conflict with ecological or more environmentally centered reasons that tree planting programs have for the residents that are participating. In many, but not all cases, people do like having trees close to their house, which is great. But there are exceptions, and those exceptions and I guess legitimate reasons why people would not want trees should be valued. Let's see. Okay. And overall, there's a lot of implications in this really up-and-coming field of tree planting and, tree planting happening on private property with publicly subsidized programs, so many things. But really, the biggest takeaway and that this continues to reiterate is that aesthetics are important to residents, and it's really, I think, trying to leverage that as an opportunity for collaboration instead of something that, should be fought against would be helpful moving forward, just because, there's a lot of fighting that's happening and it's not going anywhere. Okay, so I just defended and passed my exam, or my defense yesterday. I'm starting a new job in 2.5 weeks as a postdoc, where we're looking specifically at, at urban forest patches, which if you know landscape ecology, a forest patch is that blob of trees that exists anywhere in a matrix amongst the landscape. I don't get to do that though. I'm not an ecologist. I get to look at those 3 lower highlighted items, looking at how patch ownership varies across the Northeast, how management style varies if management exists at all, which is also a management technique in different locations, and how the land use histories of any particular place shape to what exists and what we see now. So yeah, in addition to getting to go full on into this work, I'm hoping to take a graphic design class and create graphs like this from scratch, because it's much easier than doing it through R. So since I'm the closer here, I just wanted to say, I encourage everyone to consider doing a PhD. Why? Because we get to do this for work. This is a job, and it's kind of surreal that I get to think about trees and get paid for it. And after becoming a student, there is a huge, increase in your ability to think critically, endure through any type of project, but then also to sustain a livelihood in this way. This field is predominant, is changing its face, but more diversity would be fantastic. And just know that all of this is practice. Like giving this lecture today is practice for the next lecture that we will all be doing. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me.